Hi, and welcome to the Restorative Wellness Clinicians Corner, a video series exclusively for functional health professionals, where we interview the top experts in the latest research, products, tools, and best practices for getting your clients exceptional results. Welcome, everybody, to a super special Clinicians Corner. We are so excited for our very special guest today, the one and only Dr. Jill Carnahan. You guys are in for such a treat. We are actually going to mix it up a little bit today, and it is going to be Ellen Lovelace, our lead instructor and head of curriculum, who is going to be interviewing Dr. Jill. So, Ellen, I am going to pass this over to you.
Thanks, Margaret. Good morning, Dr. Jill.
Good morning. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy to see you. Good morning, everyone. Well, I'm going to give Dr. Jill the wonderful introduction that she deserves, and then we're going to dive into talking about some things that are probably very different than what you're all used to hearing Dr. Jill talk about, because we all know her so well as a amazing functional medicine expert. So, Dr. Jill Carnahan, MD, is a board-certified integrative holistic medicine specialist, known as your functional medicine expert and often referred to as the Sherlock Holmes of Medicine, for solving the case of the most well-known medical mysteries. Utilizing state-of-the-art lab testing and biochemical analysis, she helps each patient identify the root cause of their illness by identifying nutritional or metabolic imbalances that may be contributing to their symptoms. Dr. Jill uses nutritional protocols and supplements, lifestyle changes, and medication to increase patient level of function, and always seeks the gentlest and least invasive way to restore health and optimize healing. Now, in addition to all of that, Dr. Jill is my personal physician. She has been taking care of me since 2018, and she is the clinician who discovered my mold toxicity illness and has helped me unravel my health puzzles that so many of you are very well aware of over these last 5 years or so. Now, Dr. Jill is here with us today because she has written a wonderful new book called Unexpected that we're going to really dive deep into today with her, which is really a cross between her memoir about trauma and healing and recovery, along with a personal development and sort of self-help guide designed to give practical advice for those seeking solutions to long-term chronic illness. Dr. Jill really explores the role that faith and spirituality play in the healing journey. This is coming from a medical doctor who has diagnosed and treated countless patients suffering from life-altering disease and who has also suffered from her own life-altering diseases and great loss. And this book is really a very raw and honest account of her challenges facing multiple life-threatening illnesses, living with autoimmunity and mold toxicity. And I think probably one of the most compelling things is working in a medical system that really has no tolerance for stepping outside the lines. And she really offers a lot of empowerment for taking control of our own health and well-being. So, Dr. Jill, I'm so happy to have you with us.
Ellen, I could not be more excited to be here. And I love you. And because of that, I love all of you out there. Just the work that you're doing, the energy that you always bring. There's some patients that are just like friends. And I feel that with you. I feel like there's this kindred spirit, and you always pour into me just with your joy and energy and enthusiasm and willingness to go to those levels. And so I just can't say enough. And I'm sure all of you listening know what a gem Ellen is, but I just want to speak it out because you bless my life just as much as.
Oh my gosh, already I'm crying. We're at minute 5 and I'm crying. Thank you, Dr. Jill. Thank you so much. Well, I feel the same. And, after spending all these hours snuggled up in my bed with you reading this book, I feel like we're besties. So. Tell us a little bit about why you wanted to write this book and why now also.
Yeah, so there's a really interesting backstory. In fact, I got a photo from a friend that I had done a vision board in 2016. I had written my journal that year. The 2015 I wrote my journal, and I had a vision board in 2016. 2015 in my journal I wrote, next year I'm going to write and publish a book, and next year. That was 7 years ago. And then that vision board that I just literally this morning saw, it was like impacting the world and how do we love people better and go to these deep levels of healing. And I did not know it would take me 7 years, but I just have to tell you guys all, because you are all on your own journey. And my goal with this book is, it is my story. And I felt from that first calling of writing a book, I literally argued with God. I'm like, who am I? I don't know what I'm doing. I have no idea. You know what? But the thing was, I was like, tell your story. Story is a connective tissue with humanity. And I'm not the only one out there. Every one of you listening has a story, and it's powerful. And whether you're telling the next door neighbor, or in the carpool line with your kids, another mom, or whether it's there's places where we have these opportunities to share story and share how our life is transformed. And for me, story's been that connective tissue. And I wanted a book where you could, like you said, curl up in bed and it'd be like a box of chocolates, where you're like having this little treat where you really get inspired and encouraged. But more than my story, my goal was for that each reader would see themselves as a reflection in some place in the story, and either see a place where they could grow or learn or be transformed, or have hope that anything's possible with this whole framework. And so for me, the story was so critical. And then I was told by many, many publishers, Jill, you're relatively unknown. You can't write your story. Only memoirs go for Prince Harry, or, like these people that we know really well, Michelle Obama. But I, in my heart, and this is part of the lesson in the book, is that intuitive sense of our calling and our purpose and our meaning is so powerful. And I went through a medical system that almost trained it out of me. They taught me the science of the analytical left brain and the mind, and that's powerful. And I'm a scientist at heart. I'm a bioengineer background, so I love that. But the truth is, to go to that deep place of intuition and trust your intuition about what you really are meant to do in this world, and no matter who tells you what. So I followed that path, and I ended up writing kind of a memoir. And but what I wanted to do, and you mentioned that in the beginning, is how do I take this story, this memoir, but also give the reader really practical information? So it ended up being this story, this memoir, but there's sidebars, and these sidebars have like what labs to order by the time you're 30, and how to what symptoms are mold toxicity, and how to fix your autoimmune disease. And so what I did with this is kind of combine two things in one, in this self-help how-to with very practical advice. But on that deeper level, I just rawly shared my journey, my struggles, and not just on the level of environmental toxicity, but I wanted to go deeper on our relationships and our relational toxicity. I had made a lot of mistakes in relationships, and I share that very freely in there in the book, and the toxicity of childhood and trauma, because what I found in my own healing journey is all the supplements in the world and the diet, the lifestyle are powerful. But the most powerful thing we can do is love ourselves and trust our intuition and connect with people who support us in this journey.
So true, and such a lesson that we all have to learn as healers. Absolutely. You do share a lot of really personal things in this book. And, was that sort of your process? Did you decide very early on that to do this the proper way, you had to be willing to go that deep? Because I'm sure you must have had a couple of moments of, am I really going to write this piece?
Yeah, like I talk about losing my virginity. I mean, gosh darn it. My parents, I don't even to this day know if they know about what happened. And so I'm like, okay, my family's going to read this. I mean, I'm raw in there. And
your parents don't think you're a virgin anymore, Dr. Jill.
Right, I know, right? I'm 46, and okay, mom and dad, the So the funny thing is about that, though, like I knew the people that have impacted my life were those people who get so real and authentic and are willing to share on that level. And as I was writing it, number one, it's therapeutic, right? Because I learned so much about myself. But number two, as I was writing, especially for me about the relational trauma, the childhood trauma, I saw so many of my colleagues and many of you probably out there who you might be successful in business, you have a thriving practice, or you have some purpose or meaning there, but maybe in your relationship with your spouse or your partner, or you're just serial dating, and you're like, why am I not having success here, but I'm having success here? So I saw these patterns in my own life, and I was like, there's got to be women out there like me that like have a successful business, but they suck at marriage, or they have a divorce in their history, or multiple divorces, or whatever. And those patterns are how we show up in the world and how we believe ourselves to be worthy of love. And I really found that those pieces are so profound, not only in the relational healing and having healthy, happy relationships, but also in our autoimmune disease. Because metaphorically, if we look at Gabor Mate or Peter Levine's work on trauma, autoimmunity is attack of self, right? Like we know the cells attack ourselves. And so there's a piece metaphorically that's either self-loathing or self-hatred or parts of ourselves that we have neglected or said, this is not good enough, or this is a part I don't like. And it could be our physical body, like I never liked my belly, that was my weak spot, or whatever pieces that we don't like about ourselves. But it could also be personality traits and things. And part of the healing is going to that place of really embracing and loving all parts of ourselves. And that was part of the journey for me, healing from autoimmune disease.
Absolutely. I'm curious to know, as I'm sure your family and your ex have read this book by now, how did that go? How did they all feel about this book? And did you have a lot of fear about how that might go, talking about these people in the very intimate ways that you do?
You know what I did? I had to kind of navigate. And there's a place there that I talk about childhood trauma. And it happened with a sibling of mine, a brother. And I'm going to say that here. That's actually not in the book. And that's something I did not have that deep conversation with him. And so I wrote that piece in a way where I honored him and I didn't speak out his name, because my whole goal, whether it was ex-spouse or a little bit of an abusive older brother, I actually, I thought, how can I honor what happened in this and honor those people? Because what happens when we transform, when we view all suffering, difficulty, trauma as an ability, a teacher in our life, something that can actually bring purpose, meaning, and transformation in our own growth. It's not to say that we would wish that on anyone we love. Like I never want that to be part of anyone's life. But the fact is, I bet every one of you listening has some difficulty, trauma that you could share with me, and it'd be just as difficult as the things I've gone through. And when we reframe that, when we re-look at that as, what did I learn? How can I grow? How can this make me a better person? It's actually transformational. And then all of a sudden, the abuser, the stalker, the ex-husband, the abusive brother, these are teachers. These are our soul's journeys, teachers in our lives. And instead of being like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to me, we can say, thank you. That was hard, but thank you for teaching me a lesson. And I'll share with you again, this is not all in the book, but the magic is, I had a very traumatic, sudden divorce. My ex-husband came home, said he didn't love me, and he was with another woman. And this was after 20 years of marriage. And for me, I had believed, I would have told you up until the day before he came home, that I had the best marriage in the world. I had the best husband in the world. I literally was believing those things. It completely shattered my view of reality. This happened in 2016. And I was devastated. And I was like, I went to my own fault. Like, what did I do? Why doesn't he love me? And granted, we all have a piece of the puzzle. So I had to look at myself to become a better person. But in that moment, it wasn't that I wasn't worthy of love. It wasn't that I wasn't good enough. And so that actually transformed me more than any other illness prior to that. And the end of the story is literally, to this day, my ex-husband, we talk twice a week. We just produced a documentary together. He was the film producer and I was the speaking on the talent, like the story was my story. And he'll tell me every time he hangs up the phone, he's with another woman, he's engaged. I love her. We're like so supportive, but he's like, Jill, I love you more today than I've ever loved you. Like we went through this transformational journey and it was difficult and it wasn't always love. But at this moment we've healed. And what we did in that healing was we saw each other not as like an adversary. We saw each other as wounded children that didn't know how to play in life very well. And that the transformation that the divorce took us to a very, very deep level of healing. And through that healing, we are both so much better people and so much better able to show up in the world. And now I always joke, we do business really well, but we didn't do marriage so well. I love his fiance. I love it. Like I talk to her all the time. Like it's this beautiful thing that most people don't experience, because how we show up in the world and view, like I don't see him as being this bad, awful guy. I see him as he was a wounded little boy that didn't know how to deal with his trauma and was trying to cover up. And so was I. I was a wounded little girl that had trauma and we didn't know how to fix it. And now we know better, but we are literally close friends. We made a movie together and we love one another and we're not married and we're in different relationships.
Which is just wonderful. And that ability to look at all of these traumas and adverse effects and adverse things that have happened to you through the years and turn them into learning and growth opportunities is I think, one of the most resonant things that comes out of this book. For anybody who doesn't know you and doesn't know your what you've been through a little bit, what I want to ask you ultimately is, many of us, all of these functional nutrition professionals sitting here today, most of us came to this work because of our own health crises. And I think because of that, we hear practitioners say a lot that they worry, how am I supposed to help other people when I'm so unhealthy? And so the question that I ultimately want to ask you is, did you ever have, this sort of imposter syndrome, even being a very highly trained clinician and being so sick? But maybe before you answer that, you can tell everybody the 30,000 foot overview of what is so sick for you. What did you
Sure.
go through?
Sure. Oh, Laura, I love that question so much, Ellen. So the first thing is story. So in a nutshell, I was thriving, happy, was in medical school. I was 25 years old and in my third year, and which is a clinical year. So it's really intense rotations and it's like the worst year of medical school as far as like how many hours you're working and stuff. I found a lump in my left breast literally a week after my 25th birthday. So I was incredibly young and went to get a biopsy, mammogram, all the workup. Ended up 2 weeks later, I get a call from the surgeon that did the biopsy. Her voice is cracking on the phone and she says, Jill, I don't know how to tell you this. You have aggressive breast cancer. And at that time, this is 20 years ago at Loyola University, where I was a medical student, I was the youngest one ever diagnosed. Now, sadly, since that time, we all know people in their 20s and 30s that have had breast cancer. And the issue of that is when you're 20s and 30s, I was in a young women's group of women under 40. We were considered the young ones for breast cancer. I am the only one from that group still living. And I say that because this was a death sentence. And I didn't know if I had 6 weeks or 6 months or 6 years. And breast cancer is serious in anyone, but many women who are 50s, 60s, it's slower growing. It's a little less aggressive. I'm sure you still know people who maybe even died of breast cancer. I know we all are affected by this disease, but at 25, it was absolutely life-threatening. So I went in that with, what do I do? And I chose to have all the aggressive 3-drug chemotherapy, multiple surgeries, radiation, like everything they could throw at me, they did without killing me, basically. And I went in with a very clear heart and mind as far as I looked at the data, I made decisions. And I also did nutrition and I did prayer and I did meditation. I did everything I could possibly do. My toolbox was so big. I had a naturopath, I had an MD, I had an oncologist. And all that to say, it nearly killed me. And the treatment is what I had to recover for 20 years, my immune system and my gut and everything else. The breast cancer was easy, but I did beat it. After 9 months of treatment, I got through that. I was completely bald. I learned a new word in the process called glaborious, which means hairless. And it's so much nicer to say I'm glaborious instead of bald. And I was bald as can be. And I was emaciated, I was malnourished, but I had beat the cancer. And then just 6 months later, I went back into rotations to try to finish my last year of medical school. And I went back into rotations. This is my unaware self that was dissociated from my body. I went back in and like I had always done, I grew up on a farm. So it was all about strong, hardworking German Swiss roots. Don't complain. Don't talk about pain, pull up by the bootstraps. That mentality was how I grew up. I grew up around brothers that were, the boys, and I had to be one of them. So I went back with that. I still wasn't awakened. I went back with that mentality and I was having cyclical fevers up to 102 and working in the ER. I didn't tell anyone because I was like, I just took, a leave of absence for my cancer. Now I can't be sick, but I was so sick. And my cancer's gone. I was still sick. And what happened is 6 months later, I'm in the ER taking a patient's blood pressure. I pass out cold on the floor and all of a sudden I became the patient again. That night I was taken into surgery emergency for an abscess in my bowel. And I came out the next morning and the surgeon's standing over my bed and he said, Jill, you have Crohn's disease. We took care of this abscess, but this is Crohn's disease. And I'm like, what? I just got through cancer. Like, really? And of course, Crohn's disease is autoimmune disease that attacks the gut. You all know that. But all of a sudden I was facing, and then I saw the gastroenterologist a few days later for a follow-up. And he said, Jill, this is lifelong. It's incurable. You're going to need steroids right now. You're going to need multiple immune modulating drugs, probably forever throughout your life. You're probably going to have surgery to remove part of your colon at some point, and there's no cure. And once again, here's this analytical mind. I took what I knew in medical school and I knew what he said was what I was taught. But my heart was like, that can't be right. Everything's fixable. Like Marie Forleo says, everything's figure outable. And I really believe that. And I asked him right before I left, I said, okay, doc, I get it. I'm not sure about the steroids, but does diet have anything to do with this? Because as you guys know, I was like, well, surely diet can do something with Crohn's. He did not skip a beat. And he said, Jill, diet has nothing to do with this. And I went, this is where once again, I know, like you guys know the story, but the story is, here's where once again, I went out of my head and said, okay, my heart says that can't be true. There's no way diet has nothing to do with my gut and this inflammation that I'm having. So I fired him. I never went back. And I went on a journey to search for answers. And it's funny because in medical school, you guys probably know, we do not get taught nutrition. So we are like, I didn't know any better. I grew up on a farm with like organic food and we ate well. And I knew the basics from living with my mother was a retired nurse raising 5 children, but I didn't know. And what I did is I went searching and I came across Elaine Gottschall's specific carbohydrate diet. And I was like, I have nothing to lose, right? I've got meds that are prescribed. I've got, I just had surgery. I went on that diet and within 2 weeks, my fevers, my bowel pain, my weight loss stopped. And I always say I wasn't cured then. It took about 2 more years of dealing with my microbiome and finding balance. But today, 20 years later, I don't have Crohn's disease. I talk about reversible autoimmunity. I do not have that any longer. And it's because of the diet, the nutrition, the functional nutrition approach that I did. And I just want to share that with the world because so many people with Crohn's and colitis are told it's incurable, lifelong medications. And I know you guys have seen this, and I certainly have. I've seen the reversible, of the autoimmune disease. So that's the basic story in my 20s and all those illnesses. And I think the important thing is, again, seeing these as teachers. Very early on in my breast cancer, I heard a sermon on the radio, and it was, "The sickness will not end in death. And it's for the glory of God," or for the glory, like this idea that there was a greater purpose. And I remember grabbing onto that like a lifesaver. And I just literally was like, okay, I'm not going to die, but there is a meaning and purpose here. And that was my first lesson in how tragedy and suffering can actually give us the tools we need to become a better human and to help other people. And I love, Ellen, what you said in the beginning, because the beginning was like, how do we feel as an imposter? And I'm sure at some point, every single person listening has felt this. I remember when I first started teaching doctors, a few years after the cancer and Crohn's, I've been teaching about probably 15 years. And I would go on stage and be like, oh, I did this and I beat cancer and I beat Crohn's. And I would tell them like the wrapped up, pretty bow tied version of my history of like, this is what happened. And it's kind of like I'm telling you today, and I'm cured and I'm doing great. And then I realized what you just led to, Ellen, is we are all wounded healers. And all of us who go into this still have either friends or family or ourselves where there's issues where we have tried everything and we're still ill. And for me, I had beat Crohn's and cancer, but I still had fatigue. I still had immune deficiency. I still had pancreatic insufficiency. I still had some very significant health issues. And I at first would go up on that stage and talk about it like, I cured myself from cancer and and that kind of thing. And then I realized that does nothing for those people out there that are still in the battle, still in the journey. And then I changed my tune. I started saying, you know what? I overcame these things, but today I'm still in the journey every day. And there's days when I'm tired and I feel like I can barely get out of bed. And you know what? It transformed because I saw the faces of those people in the audience, just like you. And the fact of that, taking off that mask literally and saying, I'm human, just like you. And what happens is those of us who are in this field, we do have a ton of beautiful answers that the traditional medicine doesn't even have to offer. But the bottom line is we still have either parts of ourselves that are not healed or people that we dearly love that we haven't been able to fix. And that's it. If we're a healer, that burden is so heavy because we want to help the world. We want to heal everyone, and we especially want to heal ourselves. And I just want to acknowledge, if you're not going through something now, you probably have just gone through something or you're about to. And the fact is we are all in the journey. And even me, I have a lot of answers, but I know that around the corner could be something that I come up against that I don't know what to do with, and I'm not sure how to fix it. And I go back to feeling like, am I enough? Do I know enough? Am I a true healer? And I hope that you guys can resonate with this in a beautiful way and know that we're all in this journey. Me too.
Absolutely. I think that, for all of us who are working with clients, that ends up being a really powerful moment when you can share with people what you've been through, what you're still going through, things you've tried that don't work, and places you're still struggling. And, I always appreciate it when you share that kind of wisdom with me as well. I know I've heard Jatis Karazian talk about that sort of the evolution to becoming a skilled practitioner is moving through this idea of thinking you have all the answers to getting to the place where you actually realize that you don't know much at all, right? And you're continually learning. And you said at one point in your book that it's not just that you have a passion for science, it's that you have a passion for gaining wisdom through experience, right? And sort of understanding the why behind disease. And I think that's an evolution that really all of us have to go through, right? And if you want to talk about that a little bit, moving away from this idea of I have all of the answers and I need to show my client that I have all the answers versus I need to understand that there's a role for empathy. You tell that amazing story at the very beginning of your book of the young woman who died and all you could really offer her was empathy and prayer and how powerful that was.
Yeah.
To using our intuition and embracing uncertainty, those are the pieces that those are the muscles that we all really have to learn how to flex a little bit, right?
Yeah, that's so true. Because what happened is, again, I grew up in this German Stoic engineering mindset family, very analytical, very left-brained, and I love my family for that. And I had that too. It's part of me as well. So I went into bioengineering and then medicine, and it was all about analytical science and proving it with, the labs and that. And there's an incredible value in that. But like you said, what happened is, and this is why I talk about resilience through faith and science, and it could be left-brained and right-brained, or the masculine energy and the feminine energy. Like these parts, these things are dualistic and we all have parts of them in ourselves. And so we need to find which parts are we suppressing and how do we pull that up? And the reason, and again, I have a strong faith, but not everybody may share that. And I make it very clear in the book, even if you don't believe in God at all, for me, the faith idea is the getting comfortable with the uncertainty in life. And however that looks for you, for me, it's a belief in a higher power, but for you, it may not look like that. And that's okay. But what you can do is you can embrace the fact that we want to have control. So we buy life insurance policies, we buy car and house insurance policies, and we do all these things to surround ourselves and make us feel like we have control of anything that could come our way. That is total, BS. Because the bottom line is we don't have control, and uncertainty is absolutely part of the fabric of life. So when we can actually, whatever for you works, for me, it's my deep faith, and embrace that uncertainty and actually dive into it and say, what can this teach me? The fact that I don't have control and I don't have all the answers and all of that. And on a deeper level, this science part of our left brain combined with the right brain, intuition, heart-centered place. Before the age of 40, when my husband walked in and told me he didn't love me anymore, I had really lived above the neck. I had suppressed my bodily functions and feelings, and literally medical school reinforced that, because it was like, how long can you retract in a surgery and go without eating or drinking or peeing, or, like that's what you trained your body to do, was suppress those total physiological normal needs and emotions and feelings and just be strong and stoic and be productive. And I had to unlearn that from medical school, because my body actually had something to tell me. And often our intuition comes from like, oh, I have this sense to go somewhere with a patient to ask a question. It's not necessarily scientific. It's just as you're listening and being present with that patient, you're like, oh, tell me more about your childhood and tell me more about your relationship with your father. And they're like, well, what does that have to do with nutrition? Well, maybe everything, because if they don't love themselves, or if they've been, some other types of trauma can affect how they view their bodies, how they view food, and it actually is relevant. So as you go into that intuitive right brain, you can use your body, your somatic system for data that's just as powerful as a lab test to go in the right direction. And when you combine those, that's the most powerful healer in the universe, who has the science and the intuition, the faith, the both parts.
I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. I wanted to ask you about, you talk in the book about how key it is as part of healing to sort of what you call draft a new story for yourself, right? That the story becomes one about healing and wellness and capability and letting go of that identity of being a sick person. And we all have clients who truly identify themselves as sick. Probably anybody who's been chronically ill for a while has sort of fallen into that. How do you think that maybe we as practitioners could support clients to help them change that story? And how do we help them embrace healing as also a way of life and not just an endpoint of like, first you were sick and now you're well, but that it's a journey, and viewing yourself as a sick person is not going to get you along the path. How can we help our clients with that?
Yeah, so this was an aha moment when I read Atomic Habits and then also BJ Fogg's Tiny Habits. Both those are very similar and beautiful information about how do we form habits. And again, you guys are experts in this because you're basically coaches that are helping people to form new healthy habits. So you probably have more information than even I do about this. But from my own experience, what happens is two things. First of all, Gretchen Rubin talked about abstainers and moderators. These are types of people. Abstainers are those like me who like black and white rules, like I don't eat gluten, I don't smoke, and those are just rules in my life, and I never have to use that decision or decision-making fatigue to decide if I'm going to eat gluten. I just know I don't eat gluten. And so there's never even a question. It's almost ludicrous to think that I'd eat gluten because it's not part of who I am. And this is where the identity comes in. And that abstainer model works for many people because it takes away, after a long day, we've used our brain resources, and that decision-making fatigue, should I have ice cream or should I have carrots, is going to be already spent. And so we might not have the strength to make a good decision. Moderators, I want to mention, again, this is Gretchen Rubin's work, are those people who need like an 80% or 90% rule where they do well and try to make good choices 80% of the time, but they have that cheat. You have to know who you're working with, because if you tell a moderator they can never do something, they're gonna be like, no way, because they feel deprived, right? So finding that out first is important. But this identity thing goes more with the abstainer model because it takes no effort in our decision-making in our brain. And how that works is the most effective habits happen when we start to identify with a new version of ourselves. Like, I am a healthy person. So someone may be, 100 pounds overweight, and they're like, I'm a healthy person. Because I'm a healthy person, because that's my identity, I don't eat junk food. And it just makes it much easier for them to shift if their identity is based in a new framework, and they just know that new framework doesn't do this stuff. It exercises every day. It doesn't eat junk food. And so when they start to identify, it transforms how we view, and it actually takes away some of that decision-making fatigue. And I find it so powerful because, again, I could say, like, I'm a non-smoker. I don't drink alcohol. I don't eat gluten. Those are just things for me that are part of my identity. So if I go to a party and someone offers me a vodka, there's no thought of, do I have that drink or not have that drink this time? I just know I have a Pellegrino with lime in a martini glass. It might look like a martini, but I don't drink. And so that's just for me. And there's no judgment here for whatever habit you have. But when you come with those identity things, they change who you are. And I talk about it in the book because what happens is I had gone through cancer and Crohn's, and part of the identity and the way I overcame those in my 20s was I was a fighter. Like, I was going to freaking overcome anything. And I had that identity of like, I'm going to beat cancer, I'm going to beat Crohn's. And I did. And then what happened is, the rest of my story is 2013, there was a massive flood in Boulder. It flooded my office, which was already had some issues, and took it to another level with black toxic mold. So I had always said I'm never going to do mold or Lyme disease. And the divine had a different story for me, and it was like, okay, no, you're going to learn this now. I got really, really sick from mold in that office, and I had to learn how to heal myself. And so by de facto, I became the mold expert. But all that to say, as I was making those decisions and healing myself, one day I literally remember sitting in my chair. I had just read a story of a man who was going through a bone marrow transplant, and the doctors needed to harvest a bunch of stem cells from his bone marrow. And he said, well, how many do you need? And they said, so many, hundreds of thousands. And he said, well, I'm going to meditate on that. And when they did the bone marrow biopsy, he had been meditating for 4 weeks. The amount of cells that they were able to harvest was like 10 times more than they'd ever done before. And like, what did you do? Like, how did this happen? And the guy's like, I just meditated every day on my bone marrow and enhancing those cells. And then, so it was the power, and we all know this, but it was a story of the power of the mind. That day, sitting in my chair, I had this epiphany, and it was, I have been fighting cancer, fighting Crohn's, fighting disease for decades, and I've overcome it. But right now, my body in mold-related illness is trying to fight those toxins. And in mold-related illnesses, that toxic effect triggers immune system. And now from COVID, we all know this, triggers cytokines, inflammation, and our own body gets so embroiled in the fight that it all actually causes collateral damage to our organs. So I had this epiphany that, oh my goodness, the fight analogy is actually going to kill me. My own body fighting the mold, which it can't eliminate properly, is literally going to kill me if I don't change the story. And that day I was like, okay, how can I meditate on a new story? And I came up with the little minions from Despicable Me, the little yellow guys. And I was like, that's my image of my immune system. And instead of being like fighters, they're like whistling, and they're linking arms with the mold and escorting it out of my body, but they're happy and like, Yeah, they're like the despicable me. And I literally started meditating every day on my walk on the minions and how they were helping my immune system in a cheerful, beautiful way, not fighting. And I do believe that was a transformational point in my own healing from mold.
That is so compelling to think about that difference from being a fighter to maybe I need to approach this in a different way because I'm now undergoing a fight like nothing I've undergone before, right? Like you hadn't been through enough.
Right.
I was super struck by your discussion of mold exposure as a trauma. And honestly, it was a little bit of a thunderbolt moment for me because, even knowing what I've been through, which most of our audience here knows, I've shared it in blogs, etc. It just never clicked for me that like, yes, it was traumatic to have to gut my house and move out and get rid of everything that I knew, but I didn't really ever think about it as a, capital T trauma. And I have huge gaps in memory around the whole process. And I have still intense fears, almost like PTSD about a water leak, like I can't breathe at the thought of even just thinking about a water leak. So clearly, these things are defined as trauma and it makes perfect sense. And I think for those of us who work with mold clients, which are our most advanced practitioners through restorative wellness have been trained in mold work, built a lot on what I've learned from you, honestly. We all need to be thinking about that with our clients. For those of us who do that work, how do you think we can help our clients to understand that this really is a trauma and that there need to be tools brought in to help manage that piece of it? Are there any sort of tips or tricks that you have around that?
Yeah, Ellen, gosh, I love you're saying this because what I realized is I kept seeing over and over again, just like you're describing my own personal history and my patients, there was a trauma around you have this mold related illness, you get really sick, you start to recover. And there's this like fear based, like, what if I get exposed again? And to different extents. And a lot of us, do the work and we're like, okay, I'll be okay. We can know we're okay here. But what I did in the research for the book is I realized, oh my goodness, no wonder. There's literally studies on the limbic activation. So we can be self-aware, we can have done all the work, we can have done therapy, we can love ourselves, we can have all those things in place. And literally the inhalation of the mold spores and the mycotoxins through our nose into the cribriform plate can cross right over into the brain. And it literally, there's a chemical trigger of the limbic system. So even if we are all healthy emotionally, we're all resourced, all that good stuff, even if everybody has a chemical trigger of the trauma amygdala system just from the chemical, and it includes other toxic chemicals, but mold was one of them. That was a massive like fall off my chair aha moment for me because like, oh, it's not like our fault, Ellen. It's not like we're bad or we're not good enough or we're not trauma informed or all these things that we work through. It's literally, this is a chemical trigger that triggers our brain and amygdala system. So what we have to do then is, so we could go like you and I now, we could go into a building where we smell mold and we're like, in our minds, we're like, oh, you know what? I've been here before. I know what to do. I know I can take charcoal. I can request a new hotel room. Like we're resourced and we know what to do when we're not afraid. But there's still as we inhale that, our brain still triggers that amygdala and there's trauma. So now we can decouple that, but we have to know that it's a traumatic chemical exposure. And again, some people are triggered by other environmental chemicals. It's not just mold, but that was so profound for me because it took away like the shame or the guilt around, I'm not trauma informed enough, or I'm not strong enough to overcome this because what I was seeing in clinic was this, 100% of patients, 100% had some sort of a trauma response. And it didn't matter if they were a PhD neuropsychologist who knew about trauma or taught it, or someone who had no idea, like all of us. So that was an aha, because what I realized is, okay, we have to start to decouple this trauma and start to actually do work around. And that's why the DNRS and the Gupta protocol and the Peter Levine's work, safe and sound therapy, there's so many things out there with limbic system. And now when I teach mold, the first thing I talk about in steps of recovery is not binders and liver support. I talk about limbic system, deactivate the limbic system.
I have noticed this in your, I'm like the biggest fan ever, in addition to your patient. And as I have watched your mold speeches over the years, I've noticed that now step one for you is always limbic. And it wasn't that in your earlier presentations for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So and so you guys can talk. And again, we don't have to be experts. I am not a trauma expert, but I know enough to listen to the patient and be in that heart space with them. And when I hear, how difficult it is or whatever, either give them resources. There's so many online now programs, like I said. And I'm happy, Ellen, to give your group my limbic resources. I'll just give you, it's a handout I give in the clinic. So I'll make sure after that you guys all have that if you want. It's like all the books and all the resources that are online. Some are free, some are not, but and even things like craniosacral therapy, neuro-linguistic programming. And so there's tons of ways that you can address this, but it's almost like you have to address it in some way with your patients. And you don't have to be expert. You just have to recognize. And really, part of it is just sitting with that patient saying, this is traumatic, isn't it? Because all you need to do is validate their experience. And they're going to feel heard by you and understood. And we don't have to have all the answers. We can just refer to people and like I said, if you just remind me, Ellen, I will make sure all of your
that would be wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. Because some people really resonate with Annie Hopper's program, right. And other people are like, so yeah, we have to have options, but that limbic work is so important. I want to ask you one more thing, and then I definitely want to open up to all the wonderful questions that we're getting in from our audience. Which is, you talk in the book about describing yourself and a lot of your patients as a highly sensitive person. And I even saw you did an Instagram story this week or so, sort of asking people, how many people think they're highly sensitive people? And so many of us can relate to this, or really have patients or clients in our practice who would identify like that. Can you maybe share a little bit more with all of us what that means, and what are some of the hidden gifts and strengths that actually come with having that increased sensitivity?
Yeah, and Ellen, it must resonate because you're right. I did put, I wrote a blog article, and then of course on the Instagram, I'll always follow up with a post there. And so I put a post. It was just like, I don't know what, it took off. It was crazy. It was like 10 times the views as anything else. So I'm like, oh, people resonate with this. So highly sensitive person, I learned probably in my late 30s. Elaine Aron wrote a book, and there's been so much stuff since. So now you can find it all over the internet. But Elaine Aron was one of the first, ARON, just called The Highly Sensitive Person. Great book. And I literally cried reading that because I was like, oh, I always I'm kind of an extrovert, but then I need to recharge, and like lights and sounds and too many people, like mixers where there's small talk, there's not deep conversation. I'm standing around with a bunch of people I don't know. That's stressful for me. And I might be able to be there an hour, but then I need to run back to my hotel room and, order room service and snuggle up into bed in my pajamas. That's the kind of, so I have this, and I've always been like this guilt and shame around, I love people. I love being with people. I love talking to you guys here, but why is it that I need so much recharge time in nature or alone? And why is it amusement parks are my worst nightmare? There's lights and sounds and smells and food, and it's noisy and it's hard on your system. It's it is the most traumatic thing in the world for me to go to amusement park because of again, I'm an HSP, and it's about 10 to 15% of population. So when I read this, I was like, oh, I'm not an introvert. I'm not a freak. I'm not an alien. I'm just a HSP. And there's a gift and a curse to all these things, right? So the curse is you are really sensitive. And then I realized, okay, she talks about the psychological, emotional aspect of HSPs, really important. But I went to another level because I realized all these chemically sensitive, environmental sensitive, mold sensitive people in my practice, they're HSPs, and they're not just emotionally, relationally affected, but they're affected on a chemical, on a physical level too. So we also, I believe, are more affected by sights and smells and sounds and scents and EMFs and radiation, and you name it. We're on this end of the spectrum for toxicity. So we actually feel the world, the environment much deeper, much more, in tune. And the gift of this is, as an HSP, you see details, you see sounds, you experience music in a whole different way that literally can bring you to tears, weeping from the beauty. If you've never read, Susan Cain just came out with a new book called Bittersweet. And in my mind, it's very similar because she talks about this poignancy of life. And I think those of us who are HSPs, I love being in bittersweet moments, because it's this, a funeral or a wedding or something, or a baby shower where life transitions are happening, and you see the brevity of life, and you see the importance of relationships, and you kind of see this sense of deeper meaning and purpose. And HSPs are those ones that actually see. And for me, I look back and I'm like, oh, I see details, and sometimes they're able to put together puzzles that maybe other people aren't, because I'm very aware of those details. So it's a gift and a curse. But when you see it that way, when you start to embrace that HSP and the gifts that come with it, which is high intuition, ability to solve complex problems, there is a gift in it. And I'm sure some of you listening can relate to the HSP.
Definitely. And if you go by your Instagram story, it seems like 85% of people
I know,
have
right?
CHSPs because everybody was really,
Yes.
self-selecting there. But yeah, very, very resonant. Well, we have a lot of great comments from everybody who's listening, and so many people are just thanking you for everything that you're sharing and your energy and how much everything you're saying is really resonating with all of them. Jessica talked about this. You mentioned this idea of autoimmune and sort of self-loathing going together, and asked metaphorically, what's your consideration of your breast cancer experience? And I know that you talk about this a little bit, that coming out of that breast cancer experience was really where you decided, I want to take on the most difficult challenges in medicine. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of metaphorically what the considerations were for you coming out of breast cancer?
Yeah, so Gabor Mate also, trauma, he does, so you guys I'm sure have heard of him. If you haven't, he's just a great person he's a family medicine physician that dealt with addictions and pain and started working with trauma, and really is trauma informed and one of the best teachers that I know on trauma. So he talks about in one of his books, I think Hungry Ghost is the name of the book. He talks about how breast cancer metaphorically is our nourishing organ to the world, right? Babies we nourish with milk, and it's this nourishing organ. And so metaphorically, it's usually the women who are externally loving their family and their children and taking care of, or as a physician or a healer, they're taking care of a lot of other people, and maybe they haven't really learned to take care of themselves, that self-care. And I see this pattern in a lot of women who've had breast cancer, and I definitely saw it in myself. And especially again, as an HSP, I was super sensitive. And like I say in the book, I grew up on this farm with a stoic German kind of hardworking family. And I was actually super sensitive child, but because I didn't fit in and because oversensitive was seen as a weakness, I really had to put that aside and try to be strong and tough. But in that, I learned to suppress my own needs. And part of the healing from cancer permanently and, long term has been like getting in touch with, I did practice in the early days of therapy where the therapist would literally say, Jill, right now, what do you want? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, I didn't even know what I wanted. She said, well, let's start small. How about a sip of water? And she would say, tell me what you want, and then follow through. So here's my water. She would say, I say, okay, I want a sip of water. And then I would pause and take a sip of water. Like, that's really baby steps, right? But what it did was it reinforced this idea that I can have a need, I can know what it is, I can ask for help, or I can fulfill that help myself. And as simple as a sip of water is, you start to relearn, what do I need? What do I want? How do I express that to the people around me that love me and want to help me? And then how do I actually help myself fulfill those needs and take care of myself? And that's part of the way of this bigger picture with breast cancer, is learning how to self-care, self-love, trust your intuition. Those are powerful lessons in healing.
Which are your lessons all the way through your story, right? How do I ask for what I need? How do I acknowledge that I can't do it all myself? I mean, you certainly come across as someone who can do it all themselves, but no one can do it all themselves. And that's been a big part of your journey for sure. One of our viewers is asking, is there any type of event that you're familiar with that can cause people to sort of shift to become a highly sensitive person? Is that something where, are you that way always, or do people become that as the result of things that have happened to them?
This is a great question, because in the response to the post I just put, I had people saying, oh, this is the same as ADHD. This is the same as high functioning autism. This is the same as empathetic person. It's not. Now they're close, because if you think about buckets, they could all be, there might be like empathy might be a bigger bucket over partially HSPs and other people. And then high functioning autism, there are similarities in like stimulation, light and sound and things, but they lack that social emotional awareness a lot of times. So there's differences too. So the truth is, like this is really probably 10 to 15% of the population, like Elaine Aron's work suggested. But people relate to it, I think, because what you said is, could anything else cause this? A lot of people were also writing in like, oh, this sounds like trauma that's unhealed. Well, an unhealed trauma could present with highly sensitive, because you're very like your fight or flight, your limbic system is overreactive, like we talked about earlier. So the truth is, I think a lot of things like unresolved childhood trauma, or high functioning autism, or even ADHD, there are things that could look like highly sensitive person. But what we're talking about with HSP is literally an innate part of ourselves that we're born with. So from birth, I think I actually cried less, because I was like, there's a sense of like, that knowing, I had to maintain and take care of myself and as a very young person. But there's also these things that are qualities that are literally almost from birth that define an HSP.
So interesting. What do you think about generational trauma? Do you think that that's a thing and plays a piece in all of this?
100%. And I've done my own work, continue to do work around that, because I see, I had a pattern of a lot of women who were hardworking, took care of their husbands, very conservative, didn't ask for help, didn't, act like they had needs, and really suppressed emotion. And I looked at that through both grandmothers, both sides. In fact, my grandmother, I talk about her in the book, my mother's mother. She grew up on a farm. She was the oldest girl, and her dad treated her like the hired man. Like, he loved her, but she was the oldest son that he never had. She would literally braid her hair, put it back in a cap, and wear overalls, look just like a man, worked like a man. I was like, oh, no wonder I get this from like this generational, like working
Is she
hard.
the one who lived above the auto shop and was exposed to all the terrible chemicals there?
Yes. Yeah. And she tells a story of literally they moved when she was about 16 into town where her dad bought an auto dealership and sold the farm, and they lived above a diesel, it was an auto shop. And so the gasoline and benzines and petroleum products would waft up there. And that whole family, her mother, which was my great grandmother, her father, and my great grandfather, one died of liver cancer, one died of liver failure, a sister died of metastatic melanoma to the liver, and a brother died of liver failure. None of them drank alcohol. None of them had any risk factors. So all of a sudden I was like, not only generational trauma, but toxicity. I was like, wow, this story is profound. Now, she was old enough that she got married shortly after they moved. So she was the oldest one that moved away from that environment, but all the children and her parents all had some form of death through the liver, which is our detox organ. And when I heard that, it's just a couple years ago, I was like, are you kidding me? Like, this is a profound aha in my life. Again, on the toxic epigenetic level, which we could have a whole hour discussion on, but also as I saw her as this, like, she became very masculinized to survive in that environment. I did the same thing to survive medical school and to survive growing up in my family. So we had to kind of re-embrace that feminine side.
Yeah, I thought your grandmother's story was really, that was a big, wow, compelling moment of learning about that for sure.
And just quickly, a resource that I read that I thought was so good. I'm trying to remember the author, but you'll find it. It Didn't Start With You. It's a book about ancestral trauma. I think it's one of the best written. It Didn't Start With You. I think it's Walcott. It's W-Y. I could look it up. But anyway, It Didn't Start With You book that's really good on ancestral trauma if you want to look into that.
I will absolutely look for that. I think, honestly, personal opinion here, as a Eastern European Ashkenazi Jew, I think anybody who's comes from that background and isn't thinking about generational trauma has to be missing a big piece of the picture for sure.
Thank you, Morgan. Just put in the chat. It's a Mark Woolen. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Lee is asking if there is a style of limbic work that you have found that seems to work best with children.
Oh, that's a great question. You know what? Maybe just basic somatic experiencing where you're like, you could literally, as a parent, I mean, you could be a professional too, but talking to your child about maybe they get angry and you're like, sweetheart, what are you feeling in your body right now? And actually talking them through feeling the sensations, and they might like, oh, my stomach hurts, I'm so upset, but because most if you give them that space, they're actually more in tune with their bodies than we are. So I think you could do very simple work as a parent even, and just talking to them about their body, or they, they're getting ready for school, they have a big test, and like, mommy, I don't feel well, I have a stomach ache or whatever thing there. And you're like, well, sweetheart, do you think that's related to the stress you're worried about? Like, you might talk about how the body gives us clues about stresses in life. So somatic experiencing is kind of that bucket. And of course you can have a professional, but it's not hard as a parent to just help your child be more aware of their body and their sensations. And then allowing them to just express emotion freely without judgment. So many of us grew up like, well, oh, you're not angry, or, get over it quickly, or whatever kinds of things. Yeah. Like whatever, I'm making those up, but like you could have this idea that, and again, in my family, we didn't really know how to express sadness or anger very well. So those were not emotions that were freely allowed. So I learned to suppress them because they weren't welcome. But as a parent or someone with a child, just letting them have a tantrum and say, okay, sweetheart, it's okay to be angry. Let's talk in 3 minutes when you're done being angry, and then we'll talk about how you felt. And so you can open that up. As far as real practical things, that's huge, but you could do binaural beats. So you could put headphones on your child. Binaural beats you could find classical music, any type of music, and it has different hertzes in each ear, and it tends to be calming on the system. Or some of these apps for children with meditation, those are the kind of things I would do because the kids kind of like it. They might get a feedback on a heart math. You could do a kids program. So heart math is great. That's heart rate variability. Binaural beats you can find on Spotify. Just search binaural beats. And then any sort of somatic talk where you can talk to them about their body sensations in relation to their emotions.
Oh, those are great tips, actually. Yeah. You talked a little bit about that you say that every instance of healing that you witness sort of comes down to this very simple idea of believing that something else is possible. And I'm curious, how do you create a safe space for that conversation with your patients? Not every person you work with is going to be in a place where they're open to having that kind of conversation. So how can we support clients who are kind of reluctant to even go there, to get them to open up to those types of ideas?
Oh, this is a great question, Ellen. I think the thing is, if you see your client as any behavior, we could say bad behavior, which we don't want to judge, but like something where you're like, oh, come on, they're not going to get well with that. And just between us here, we could say it that way. But when you see a behavior that is harming them or not helping them to get where they want to go, what we can do is what I found at the root of all healing is not only unconditional love for ourselves, which we've talked about extensively, but when we have that, we can sit in a space with a client, no matter how bad their behavior, how resistant they are to change, and we can love them unconditionally exactly where they're at. And what happens there is like, oh my goodness, I so understand how tough that must be to change your diet soda habit or whatever it is. Because usually those behaviors, they came from their own trauma and in a way to deal with life. It might be, again, snacking at night because they're what happens most times with trauma and addiction, and this can go with food, it can go with alcohol, it can go with drugs, or for someone like me, it can go with work. And all of these things, what we do is we try to keep busy or do something to cover up the pain. So if you as a practitioner can understand, oh my gosh, this behavior comes from some pain point, and have the deepest compassion, like, oh, like you can even say, I do this to myself, and I start to do it with my patients sometimes, especially if I know them well. Oh, sweetheart, you're doing a great job. Like you have to feel if that situation is right, but like that's how we should talk to ourselves. And that's how we can think of our patients in this very gentle, compassionate space. Knowing that their behaviors that maybe aren't serving them are truly just coming from maladaptive patterns. And by acknowledging that, but also having deep compassion, because they had enough shame, right? Shame is the thing that drives people to kill other people. Shame is a horrible, horrible place and a horrible emotion. And if we have practitioners can make sure that we're a place of no shame and no judgment and pure love and compassion, all of a sudden we give them permission to start examining their behaviors in a way that's free of judgment, free of, any sort of guilt, and for sure free of shame. And we have this, like, again, you don't have to say this out loud, but you can be thinking, oh, sweetheart, I know that comes from a place of deep woundedness or pain. And I know that behavior that you're choosing to do is purely because it's so hard to feel the emotions that might come up if you didn't do that behavior. For me, when I stopped working, I had to deal with sadness and grief and things, like not stop working, but I was working so long and so much, so many hours. That was my way of covering up, sitting with myself and my feelings. So if you can come at that with just the deepest compassion and knowing that they may want to change, but they may be just held back from that because of their own fear. And when you do that, you allow them to have a space that's non-judgmental, and that's where change starts.
So much power in that. So much power. And if you've ever gotten an email from Dr. Jill, it is signed, "You are loved." And I have to say, the first few times I saw that, I thought, it's an interesting approach, but I absolutely understand now where that comes from and why you sign your email.
Yeah.
Margaret, did you have anything that you want to add? This has been such a wonderful conversation, Dr. Jill. Thank you so much for this.
Yes, I'm blown away. I have had the great fortune of reading, Dr. Jill, your book. I've spent the last few days with it, and I've always admired you as a practitioner. Getting to know you, I actually was telling Ellen before we signed on here, I think this is one of the most important books that's been written because nobody talks about the story and the personal journey behind it. We hear snippets, right? Like you hear this is my hero's journey at the beginning of the talk, and then they go into all the stuff,
Right.
But really honoring that deeper spiritual aspect of healing, which we know is really essential for ourselves, for every single person we work with. It is, congratulations. You've done something really special and really important here. And I was very, very touched. I can't wait for everybody to get their hands on it. I think you shared the link. It's readunexpected.com.
And it comes out at the end of this month, I believe.
Yeah.
So right now
You're
in pre-order status right now.
Yeah. So I've already got my pre-order. I encourage everybody else to do the same and get it for your clients too. I think this is something that you said at the very outset. You were hoping that people can see themselves in it, and you've really achieved that on so many different levels. So everyone, get this book, share it. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you both. I love and appreciate you so much. And thank you for having me. Thank you for letting me share my heart. There is no greater joy when I can connect with people like you. And I love that you said, what I hope too is, like you said, if you do share it with clients, maybe it can be an opening to that conversation, to these places that we went to today. Because all of our people and we all need this. We all need unconditional love. And we need this level of healing if we're going to change the world. We really do.
Thank you.
Absolutely, we do. We do. Thank you so much, Dr. Jill. It's such an honor to have you with us, and it is such a joy to have you in my life personally, that this has just been really meaningful, I think, for all of us. I told my husband this morning, I was like, I can't screw this up. It's Dr. Jill.
Oh.
I have to do right by her.
Oh, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. And I hope to hear feedback if you do end up getting the book. I'd love to hear more.
Thank you all. Thank you, Ellen. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you very soon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.